The story of how Montgomery County came to be can be traced back to one family, the Lee family. The founding of Silver Spring, even the start of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, all point back to generations of Lees. Montgomery County Planning Board Chair Casey Anderson wanted to learn more about this family and its influence on the history of the county, so he arranged an interview with attorney David Scull, a former county council member, civic advocate, and part of the Lee family. Mr. Scull met with Chair Anderson at the historic Mrs. K's Tollhouse on Colesville Road to talk about the history of planning and politics in Montgomery County and how Mr. Scull's family was pivotal in creating the county that we call home today.
We're here at Mrs. K's Tollhouse restaurant with Dave Scull, and Dave has agreed to talk to me a little bit today about the history of his family and extended family and their role in politics and especially in land use and the development of Montgomery County. But first I wanted to mention that we're here at Mrs. K's because Dave thought this would be a good place to do this interview. Can you tell us why you wanted to be here at Mrs. K's?
Thinking that I knew a lot of local history, and I grew up a couple hundred yards from here in a house built in the 1830s, same vintage as the old Silver Spring house that my mother was born in. And I've been telling people for years that the Washington doctor who built that as a weekend place knew one thing: he didn't want to pay any tolls. So his driveway came out on both sides, which it did, and the public never figured it out. And then I said, excess of caution, I'll Google Mrs. K's. Turns out this place was built in 1903, 70 years later, and the turnpike that it was the toll house for wasn't chartered until the 1870s. So
the driveway has some other story behind it?
I can't believe it wasn't something he wanted to avoid, because why else bother with?
Can you talk a little bit about the family and its conception of its role in the county and the state's politics in relation to the pre-existing political machine and how they in turn became their own machine?
Well, Blair Lee the First was relatively very liberal for his day and was happy to be in a sort of outsider role. But he was a major player in state politics, and that was the colonel's entree to real political influence. And the colonel looked around for a wife and decided it should be somebody from Prince George's County, because he was sort of this small group of influential people. He was the Washington area guy. So he married into the Prince George's establishment of that day. And that gave him a bi-county perspective and was an important part of his role in the small group that ran things. And the Depression came along, and the good times stopped rolling. And he owned a lot of land, but he had to step really quickly to stay ahead of foreclosures and things like that. So it made him a tough businessman. And he was smart and foresighted, but basically the business bottom line was his bottom line. And he was not a reformer in the context we think of reform, from the 50s on. Not a civil rights reformer, not a consumer advocate, not an environmentalist. He was a businessman.
But I take it that at that point there was that the fault lines were more between the up-county interests around Rockville and the sort of the old Montgomery County and the newer suburbs of Washington centered around the Lee's land interests, but also the people who were supportive of zoning and orderly processes and rules for developing real estate, which made them in some ways allies of some of the people today, like the civic activists that we would today think of as naturally being opposed to the interests of family that was in the real estate business. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think it might be simpler than that. As a political boss, he really was the political boss of the county for several decades, and a smart political operator. He knew how to make friends and dispense, minor patronage and keep people happy. And the county was overwhelmingly rural until Washington, D.C. started to grow. And the main way to get around was the railroad, because that was better than most of the roads. But anyway, the first places to develop were the close-in areas of Montgomery County, Silver Spring and Bethesda, Chevy Chase. And the Colonel was the main player in the Silver Spring area. He wasn't really involved in the western side of the district line, of the Maryland side of the line at all. But as he started building houses, especially from Tacoma Park out, and railroad stations developed and people commuted that way, the people who were buying houses in Montgomery County wanted services. They wanted schools and libraries and police and parks and things like that, things that the Colonel's rural constituents weren't interested in paying for. So the new arrivals opened their Maryland Constitution and said, whoa, look, we can create a municipality and we'll have the ability to take care of these things for ourselves, and we won't need the support of the county, the rest of the county. We can do the stuff ourselves. So they started doing that, and the Colonel said to himself, wait a minute, they're getting powers that are important to me, water and sewer and zoning and roads. So he opened his copy of the Maryland Constitution and says, what can I do about this? And the powers of municipalities are really very extensive. Maryland is one of those states that says, well, municipalities really have all the powers except the ones we say they don't have. And they can do pretty much anything. So he said, there are a lot of municipalities scattered around the state. I don't want to make them all mad. So he dreamed up the bi-county agencies, the Park and Planning and WSSC. And he did it for, I think, a couple of reasons. And I never talked to him directly about this, so it's a fair amount of family lore here. But as he traveled to Prince George's, he could see this big proliferation of very small municipal entities. And this struck him as the wrong way for a suburb to develop. He thought it would be more attractive and more efficient and better organized if there was some kind of central planning entity. So he dreamed up the bi-county agencies, and part of their function was to limit the further spread in Montgomery County, his county, of more municipal entities. And in order to satisfy the new arrivals' desire for services, he also dreamed up the service districts, the tax districts, so that my tax bill used to look like a New York Times acrostic with a park district tax and a library tax and the trash tax and all these services that if you wanted it, go to the colonel, and he would create a tax district to give you what you wanted, and his rural buddies wouldn't have to pay for it. It was good politics, and delivered the services. And it really, in many ways, eliminated the need for more municipal entities. So it gave him what he wanted, and he thought it was giving the voters the services they wanted, if not the powers that may not really have been all that important to them. They were mostly concerned with making their immediate area nicer places to live with the services they wanted. So it was a marriage of convenience, and the historical retrospective on that is that it has served the county well. The county is attractive and generally better planned than a lot of other suburban jurisdictions. And I think of Northern Virginia as not as coherently planned as Montgomery County has emerged to be. So he's credited with vision and foresight. It happened to definitely accommodate his business interests, but it worked out and seems to be still working well.
I think now might be a good time to introduce your father. How did your mother and father meet and come to be married?
The men in the family all seem to have gone to Princeton, and among their club mates at Princeton, Blair and Brooks club mates, was David Scull from Philadelphia. And they decided that he would be a good fellow for their sister Elizabeth to meet. So they met, and the World War II was now on, so they decided they would get married right away before he went off to war and might not come back. So at 19, she dropped out of college. They got married at the Army base where he was training to be sent to North Africa. And I was born 9 months and 2 days later. And he didn't go to North Africa. They had a change of plans. The Army changed his plan. The Japanese had invaded the Aleutian Islands. So in their desert uniforms, they were shipped up to Alaska, where they got very cold. But the Japanese thought better of it and vacated before they got there to the island of Attu anyway. And then he was shipped over to Europe.
And this would have been almost at exactly the same time that the colonel was losing a congressional race in 1942. Is that right?
Yes.
And some people say that was really that was the end of his time in public office, but he continued to be
he still ran the county. He kept control of appointments to Park and Planning and WSSC for many more years. That wasn't legislated back to the local governments until the 50s. And he remained a major player for a very long time. And it was basically a battle between the new arrivals and the colonel, fighting the colonel's machine.
Okay, so we're at the period of the Second World War, and your mother and father have met. He's shipped off, and he comes back. And then what?
He had studied nuclear chemistry at Princeton and wanted to go into plastics before Dustin Hoffman told the world that's where the future lay. He went to work for a plastics company in New England, was very involved for several years, and then the guy who was the son of the owner of the company joined the company, and my father said to himself, I don't think I'm going to be the president of this company. And right about then he got a phone call from the colonel, Dave, come down and help me develop this land. I own a lot of land. And he said, why not? So he changed careers, came down, got a real estate license, and went to work for the colonel developing a lot of the land that's built a lot of developments that are still here, still occupied and used. And he got interested in politics. Unfortunately, he was a Republican, which was sort of heretical in the Lee family. But the colonel tolerated it. The colonel still seemed to control appointments to a lot of things, so he got my father appointed to the planning board in the 50s. And And that was when they laid out the Beltway. And they tried to figure out how to put a freeway from the northern suburbs downtown into Washington.
Okay, so your father gets interested in politics, albeit Republican politics, and that's okay with the colonel as far as it goes. But at some point there, he is off the reservation. So how does that transpire?
There was a growing rift in philosophy between my father and therefore also my mother, who had switched to a Republican to assist him with his career, and the colonel, who thought that the family business should be everybody's priority. And my father became chairman of the county Republican committee and worked hard to develop a Republican precinct organization that could actually wage competitive election campaigns. And they did elect Gilbert Goody to Congress, and before that Gilbert Goody to the state senate. And there were Republicans on the county council from time to time. My father became state Republican chairman in '62, and then the civil rights movement came along, and that's certainly worth a word because of how it affects family relations. My father found himself in contact with the Mitchell family of Baltimore, the founders of the NAACP, who were still Republicans in the early '60s, the party of Lincoln. And Goldwater was the Republican candidate for president in '64, and he ran on a basically anti-civil rights platform. And my father, who had introduced Goldwater as our next president back in the '61, I think, at a meeting I attended, found himself unable to support Goldwater's anti-civil rights platform. And so my father was that year running for something called Congress at Large that doesn't exist anymore. It was a fluke of reapportionment, a statewide office. And he was the only Republican in the state who didn't support the party's presidential candidate, Goldwater. And it so infuriated the right wing of the party that the moderates he'd been working with for a decade to build up the party organization were literally afraid to be seen talking to him. And he lost the election by the same margin Goldwater lost the state to Lyndon Johnson. So he was out of politics for 2 years, and he and my mother were very involved in organizing the housing movement to highlight the poverty pockets around the county, many small pre- and post-slavery black communities, where people were literally living in chicken coops. And they organized 40 or more churches and synagogues to do something about it. And they started staging highly visible reform efforts. My father was great at picking slow news days like Thanksgiving and Christmas to go out and move an elderly man out of a chicken coop in Tobytown out in Potomac into, in that case, my father's former campaign trailer, but a nice little, a real dwelling in which, with services. And he parked it in Tobytown and moved Robert Martin into it. And the county council during that cycle were 7 very conservative Republicans who were infuriated, so they directed the county manager to do something about the trailer, and he opened his county code and said, Tobytown is not a recognized trailer park, so it's got to go. So on the next slow news day, my father went out and took the wheels off the trailer and put it on cinder blocks. It's not a trailer anymore, so it fits. So this was front page stuff, and it went on, and it did a great job of opening people's perceptions that rich Montgomery County had a real serious housing problem. And they would find a house in somewhere, usually down county, that was in poor shape and fix it up and then move one of these families in very substandard housing into a real nice house, and then help them, give them counseling, help them do budgeting and home maintenance, things like that. So by '66, there was quite a lot of momentum, public opinion for the county to get serious about doing something for housing. And my father ran for county council in '66 as a Republican, and the way that election bounced out, 3 Democrats, all quite liberal, and 4 Republicans, 3 quite conservative, and my father, now quite a liberal Republican. And when the Republicans caucused and he suggested that he be elected council president the first year of the 4-year cycle, they said, "Dave, you're just not our kind of Republican. We're not voting for you now or ever." So he went to one of the Democrats, who happened to be our next door neighbor, and they talked, and on the first day of the new council, he was elected president with the votes of the 3 Democrats. And he had the votes for whatever he wanted to push. And the most visible one was the nation's first open housing law, which it's hard to imagine today the reaction you got in liberal Montgomery County to what wouldn't seem controversial at all anymore. He took 2 bullets in the window of his real estate office in Silver Spring and 1 in the window of our house in Silver Spring, and found himself denounced in full-page screeds by the colonel, his own father-in-law, who thought this was the wrong direction for society to go. There was wide public support for what he did, and the open housing law passed just a few months before my father fell over dead at a county council meeting at age 50 of a heart attack with no prior history of heart trouble. But fortunately, the vote was cast while he was still alive and well, and it had a very, very wide impact. A few months after he died, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and the Congress responded shortly after that with a nationwide open housing law, which would have been utterly inconceivable a year earlier had they not just seen it happen in their own backyard. And lots of congressmen own houses in Montgomery County, and we're undoubtedly just as worried as homeowners everywhere what this change would mean for us. And that's one of the great joys of doing local government here in Montgomery County. We have a openness towards trying new things and a willingness to try to make them work. And when they do work, as they usually do, they are picked up quickly, lots of other places because. So that's the short story of Dave Scull, my dad.
So what else was your mother, well, what else were your parents, I should say, interested in? I mean, you alluded to this idea. This is during a time of a lot of change going on nationally, Vietnam and sort of getting into the Watergate period and the interest in reform, opening up the political process.
Well, the causes then were rights of criminal defendants. So my father's council created the system of public defenders. And they decided that there was a crisis and scandal just before they took office. The 7-member, very conservative Republican council, most of them lost that election, and they decided to grant all the rezonings that were pending between the election date and the swear-in date.
This is the Diggs Council?
This was the notorious Diggs Council. And so anywhere in the county you see a high-rise popping up in a place where there's nothing else high around it, that was a Diggs Council rezoning. And that really frosted the population on Republicans, who there weren't any more elected to the council for many decades after that, and on the zoning process. So one of the other reforms was to create zoning hearing examiners because these zoning cases took a great deal of time and detail, and the council wasn't able to really give that much time and attention to all the specifics of all the cases as the county kept growing. So the hearing examiners professionalized that process a lot. And there wasn't, there were consumer bills, but mostly it was civil rights and clean government and modernizing government.
So what were the land use politics of the county as you remember them growing up and then later when you were in public office? I mean, my perception is that the political campaigns prior to the 70s were largely played out along the lines of growth politics, with slates forming on one side or the other of development issues, perhaps with the complication that you mentioned earlier about, the Lees were savvy about trying to co-opt some of their opponents, try to win over support from people who might otherwise have been opposed to what they were trying to do, but that there used to be a much heavier role for land use politics than we have today, where campaigns are not really so much about real estate development and growth, but a whole bunch of different issues involving whatever coalitions candidates can string together in a sort of more entrepreneurial kind of a way. Is that accurate? Or how
I'm
do you
sure it
remember
is, because there was a lot of growth going on, and that's the kind of activity that generates political interest. There are always people nearby who feel strongly about it. We don't have all that much growth anymore. The county's kind of filled out, and the ag reserve is sitting there, and every so often there are efforts to change that. I remember sitting through a hearing where the zoning lawyers for the developers came in and said, "We have a constitutional right to sewer service in the ag reserve." I said, "Really?" Let's see your argument.
Where does it say that in the Constitution? I don't remember the water and sewer clause of.
And they said, and I said, "Does the county executive support this?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "Well, that's really interesting." But that was the last we heard of it, because there's a strong body of opinion that supports the concept of the ag reserve. No, I think it's more a function of what's going on. I mean, I think growth politics is still an issue in areas where serious growth and change are proposed, but it's not the main or almost only issue the way it used to be.
Well, I didn't want to lose the thread of your time in public office. So you were on the council and enjoying yourself, passing bills, and at some time you decided you wanted to run for county executive.
Right, and that was a very educating experience. I thought I'd been doing a terrific job, and the truth is, in local politics, the people who are most likely to remember what you did are the people who don't like it, because it affects them personally. And in theory, the public wants their elected officials to make those tough decisions. In reality, they want them to make them in their favor, because they just assume that's what the public interest is. So if you rock the boat enough, you're going to make a lot of enemies. And they'll stop being mad after a while, but not right away. And I concluded, if you're doing any sort of a real job as an elected official, you're working your way out of a job. And your objective shouldn't be to be reelected indefinitely, because somebody has to put the landfill somewhere and the highway somewhere and step on toes. And that's what we're sent there to do, and we should see more of that.
Well, thanks, Dave. That's great. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for your interest in in the history of the county.